Hi, I'm Amara, and my family branded me a rejected mail-order bride, shamed me as unlovable, and mocked my pain in front of strangers until I turned their lies into a reckoning they never saw coming. They thought they could erase me, but the man who truly saw me gave me the strength to reclaim my story, and at my wedding, their shame silenced them. Stay with me. This is a heart-wrenching, explosive tale of betrayal and triumph that will grip you to the end. It was a Saturday morning, like any other in our family. Oversized platters, mismatched coffee mugs, and conversations that drifted toward things no one actually wanted to say out loud. The air smelled like blueberry muffins and powdered sugar, but beneath it, something bitter always lingered. We were all seated around the long, scratched-up pine table in my parents' dining room. The wallpaper had faded, but the tension hadn't. I was wedged between my cousin Tessa and the window that hadn't opened properly in decades. My plate was the only one with a napkin tucked under the fork because I'd placed it there myself. Small rituals. They helped me stay quiet. Mom raised her glass of grapefruit juice and said, "Let's toast to Lila's upcoming bridal shower. God knows she earned it. Unlike some people, she's got self-control." Her smile was sweet as syrup. "You could learn from her, Amara," she added, her voice dripping with disdain. Everyone laughed. Dad gave a low chuckle, barely looking up from his plate. Lila flipped her hair and shot me a look like I was a mosquito buzzing in her ear. I forced a smile. Tight, practiced. I didn't say anything. I just stared at the jam pooling next to my scone, wishing I could disappear into it. Someone passed a dish I didn't ask for. I nodded, said, "Thank you," and tried not to breathe too loud. Then came the comment that tied a neat bow on the whole performance. "You still hear from that farmer guy?" It was Cousin Hazel. Her voice syrupy, but the edge was sharp. The mail order one. Poor guy probably thought he was getting a model. Not all this. She gestured vaguely in my direction, as if I were a pile of moving boxes someone had forgotten to put away. "No one's surprised he sent you back," Hazel sneered, her words cutting deeper than I'd admit. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. Instead, I just nodded, like she'd asked the weather forecast. Someone laughed, too loud. "That story made the rounds at church," Uncle Frank added with a smirk. "I mean, you got sent back like a bad shipment. That's a first for Silver Pines." I felt the words like paper cuts across my skin, thin, mean, and precise. I pushed my chair back slowly, not dramatic, just enough. No one stopped talking. No one asked if I was okay. No one even noticed me leave. I went upstairs to what used to be my bedroom. Now it was storage. But the light still came through the curtains in the same soft way it did when I was 12. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around. My old dresser was still there, but the mirror was gone. I opened the top drawer without thinking. Inside was a bundle of linens, some yellowed, some fraying. At the bottom, wrapped in a worn piece of muslin, I found it, the napkin. It was the first one I ever embroidered, a little daisy in one corner, crooked, overstitched, but still intact. I pressed it into my palm like a bandage, though nothing was bleeding. Not yet, anyway. I used to think staying quiet was a kind of loyalty, that silence meant grace, but maybe it just made it easier for them to forget I was there. Downstairs, a door slammed. I heard the familiar clack of heels on hardwood. Lila's voice floated up the stairs, light and cold. "You really thought he was going to marry you?" "That's the funniest thing I've heard all year." She paused at the bottom of the steps, then added, "No offense, just be real." "You're a joke, Amara," she called out, her laughter echoing like a slap. I didn't reply. I just sat there, holding the stitched napkin, wishing it could sew up everything they'd torn inside me. I folded the napkin and placed it gently back into the drawer where I'd found it. No dramatic slams, just careful movements, like I was afraid even the fabric would judge me. The hallway smelled like citrus polish and old memories. I walked past the family portraits without glancing at them. Lila in her prom crown, Glenn holding a baseball bat, Mom wearing pearls she only ever wore for church photos, I wasn't in any of them past the age of 17. By the time I stepped outside, the morning air had shifted. The sun was higher, catching on windshields and church signs. I wrapped my coat tighter and took the long way to the grocery store, cutting through the town square to avoid passing the cafe where Lila usually held court. I should have known that detour wouldn't save me. Two women stood near the Veterans Memorial mid-conversation, holding coffee cups with church logos on them. I recognized their faces, Mrs. Carver and her sister. They never made eye contact with me at service, but they always found ways to mention my name when they thought I couldn't hear. "She stood at the station for hours, bless her heart," one of them said, her voice just a little too loud to be innocent in that thin coat and everything. A shame about her figure, though. No wonder he changed his mind. "Some girls just don't understand subtlety," the other replied, sipping from her cup. "Delicate girls win, always have." He probably expected someone softer. I stopped walking. My heel caught on a crack in the sidewalk, and for a second I thought I might fall. But it wasn't the crack. It was the weight of that word. Delicate. They didn't notice me standing there, or maybe they did and just didn't care. That was the thing about women like them. They were never cruel outright, just surgical with their words. The grocery bag on my arm suddenly felt heavier than it should have. I didn't move. My chest tightened. My throat itched to speak, but nothing came. I turned and walked the rest of the block in silence, the pavement echoing underfoot like it was laughing with them. The flashback hit hard and fast. I was back on that platform, Silver Pines. The snow wasn't falling. It was slicing sideways, sharp and fast. I'd arrived with one suitcase and a folded-up piece of paper where Nathan Brooks had written his address. He walked up slow, boots crunching in the snow, and when he saw me, something behind his eyes shifted. "You're not what I expected," he said. "I thought you'd be different," he added, his voice laced with disappointment. That was it. No welcome, no handshake, just those words. I tried to smile then too. I remember thinking, maybe I can change his mind. Maybe if I'm useful. Maybe if I'm kind. But he didn't ask me anything. Just loaded my suitcase into the wagon like he was hauling grain. I stayed in that barn loft 3 nights. The third night, he brought me a bowl of stew and said, "There's a boarding house in town. I'll cover the month." "It's for the best," he muttered, avoiding my gaze. But after that, he didn't finish the sentence. By the 4th morning, I was back at the train station, the snow soaking through my boots and into my socks. I sat on a bench that stung with cold. No return ticket in my hand. Just that suitcase and the silence of everyone I had once called family. No one called, not even my mother. Back in the present, I stepped onto the porch of Mom's house later that evening, grocery bags in hand. She'd asked for cream and sugar, claimed she wanted to make cookies for the neighbor. I knew it was just another reason to keep me busy and quiet. Lila arrived minutes later in a soft lavender dress that hugged her like it had been custom stitched. Her hair was pinned back in a perfect twist, not a strand out of place. She vaulted into the living room like she owned the oxygen. "Guess what?" she said, tossing her phone onto the couch beside me. "I'm gonna be a bridesmaid, his bridesmaid." I blinked. "Slow his?" She smiled like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Nathan. Small world, huh? He said he wanted someone elegant, someone who could help him spot the right look. I told him I'd help him pick one. He said you were too much for him," she taunted, her eyes gleaming with malice. I didn't say anything. My eyes drifted to her phone screen. It was a photo, her standing in front of that same train station where I had once waited, her coat the exact shade as the one I wore that day, except she was laughing, arms linked with Nathan, like they were rehearsing for a catalog. The caption read, "Sometimes second chances come dressed better." I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just looked at that photo and thought, she's standing where I once stood, but no one will remember that part. In that photo, she stood where I once did. Same station, same coat color, different ending. Maybe that's the real lesson. Some girls are built for display. Others are stitched for use and then forgotten. But that night, as I stitched the hem of someone else's dress for extra money, I realized something I'd ignored for years. I'm done being their shadow, I whispered to the needle, my resolve igniting. That evening, after finishing the hem job, I wiped my fingers clean on the threadbare cloth by the sink and turned off the machine. The hum of the needle had been a kind of comfort, but the silence afterward felt heavier than it used to. I poured myself a glass of water, let it sit on the counter, and instead just stood there in the dim kitchen, listening to the house settle like an old spine cracking. The next afternoon, late afternoon sun bled through the blinds as I stood over a mixing bowl, elbow deep in flour, helping Mama prep for Saturday. The air smelled like cinnamon and something burnt clinging to the oven walls. She moved around the kitchen with the kind of grace that made her seem capable, even when her words cut. She handed me a stack of biscuit tins to grease. Lila's coming by later to try on the dress again. It's still a little tight, but she'll squeeze. I didn't respond, just reached for the butter. A few minutes passed before I asked, softly, casual enough to seem like I wasn't clinging to the answer. Whatever happened to Grandma Eleanor's gold necklace? The one in the walnut box? I haven't seen it in ages. Mama didn't pause, not right away. She kept whisking her cream mix, but her voice dipped smooth and offhand, like she was talking about who borrowed a pie plate. Oh, that I already gave it to Lila. She'll wear it for the engagement shoot. Goes better with her neckline. You never deserved it anyway, she said coolly, her words a dagger to my heart. I didn't ask another thing. I just nodded, stirred the batter, and focused on the sound of the spoon scraping the bowl. That necklace had been shown to me when I was 18. We were cleaning out Grandma's attic together, just the two of us, and Mama had opened a little walnut box lined in blue velvet. Inside was the necklace, simple, vintage, with a heart-shaped pearl in the center. One day this will be yours, she said, without looking at me. You're the older one after all. She even let me hold it that day. I stood by the dusty attic window, light catching the gold chain, and imagined myself wearing it on my wedding day. Maybe back when I still thought I'd have one. Back when I thought older meant first, not discarded. Now Lila would wear it in pictures that would make their way into town newsletters and fridge magnets. People would see it and say, "Wow, what a lucky girl." They wouldn't know it was mine, that it had ever been meant for me. But somewhere along the way, when I'd become the one who got sent back, I'd also been erased from every script my family had once written me into, quietly, completely, and they hadn't needed to say a word. Later that night, I found Mama in the kitchen again, wiping down the silverware, giving everything a little polish before Saturday. She had her glasses pushed up to her forehead and a dish towel slung over one shoulder like she'd earned some battle medal. I leaned on the doorframe, arms crossed, trying to keep my voice even. That necklace, it was supposed to be mine. She glanced up. Well, honey, Lila is the one who will actually be seen. You know, you wouldn't want to draw attention to yourself. You're too much for this family, she snapped, her eyes cold and unyielding. I held her gaze for a long moment. My face stayed still, but inside something gave way, like a seam under too much tension. I didn't argue. I didn't explain how many things I'd already swallowed in this house. I just turned and walked out, pushing open the back door like I'd done 1,000 times before. The air outside was cooler now, faint smell of grass and soil. I walked around to the garage where Dad kept all the Christmas decorations and broken furniture we never threw away. Tucked behind an old mattress was the box I needed, my sewing kit. I carried it inside and set it on the table in my room, opened the lid, and reached for a folded scrap of blue silk. It wasn't valuable, it wasn't even part of a project, but it was mine. The color reminded me of Grandma's walnut box lining. The texture felt like a whisper. If I'm not going to inherit anything, I thought, unfolding the silk across my lap, I'll make something of my own. The necklace had been promised to me, but promises fade faster than value when beauty enters the room, and as I pressed the foot pedal on my old machine that night, it finally hit me. I had stopped expecting anything from them a long time ago. I'll stitch my own legacy, I vowed, my hands steady with purpose. The next morning, I set out early to pick up some canned apples and butter from the local grocery store. I didn't expect to run into anyone I knew. That store had always been my quiet spot. Fluorescent lights, slow-moving carts, and old folks reading labels like they were contracts. I was in aisle 4 comparing prices on baking powder when I heard his voice. Familiar, steady, laughing too loud for the size of the store. Len, my father. He was talking to someone near the canned peas, one of his old co-workers, I think. A man I'd seen once or twice at Labor Day cookouts, the type who always said, "You're looking healthy," like it was a compliment. And there was my father, clear as day. We tried, but she's difficult, still blaming us for that mail-order mess. Can't help someone who doesn't want to help herself. She's always been a burden, he added, his words slicing through me. I froze, not because I thought it wasn't true, but because it was him saying it in public, like I was a burden he'd carried for too long, and now felt entitled to lay down right there, between the Bush's cans and the cat food. I ducked behind the nearest shelf. My heart thudded so loud I was sure they'd hear it. She needs to move on, he added. Lila's doing great. She's always been the one with potential. Folks like seeing her win. They chuckled. Then a cart rolled. The moment passed, but it had already split something inside me wide open. I stood there for a while after they walked off, just stared at the cardboard boxes of penne pasta, each one looking more stable than I felt. Then I left. Didn't get the apples, didn't get the butter, just drove home. On the way, my mind dug up an old memory, the kind that only shows up when your chest already feels raw. I was 10, maybe 11. I'd had a nightmare about being locked outside the house. It felt so real. I woke up crying. My father came into my room, sat on the edge of the bed, and wiped my cheek with his sleeve. If the world says you don't belong, he'd whispered, you come home. You always belong here. But standing in that store, hiding behind a tower of sale items like a stranger in my own life, I realized something awful. Even home was siding with the world now. That evening, I waited at the kitchen table. I waited until I heard the garage door creak open and his boots scuff across the mat. He smelled like sawdust and grease, the same way he had since I was little. I didn't greet him. He set his keys down, stretched his back, noticed me still sitting there, quiet. You said I made everything harder, I said, keeping my voice level, out loud, to someone else. He sighed, took his time sitting down across from me. I was trying to make it less awkward, he replied, like it was some kind of mercy. You're not exactly easy to explain, Amara. You're an embarrassment, he said bluntly, his words a final blow. That hit harder than any slap could have. Explain, I repeated. He looked down at his hands. People ask questions. They remember the story. You don't exactly help your own case. I wanted to ask what my case even meant. I wanted to remind him I wasn't the one who shipped myself across state lines only to be turned into a joke. I wanted to shout, but instead I stood, slowly, quietly. Thanks for clearing it up for them, I said. He didn't stop me, didn't say my name, just stayed there, pretending to pick at a splinter on the table's edge, like it was somehow more urgent than his own daughter's grief. I walked upstairs and into my room, still half filled with boxes Mama never bothered unpacking after I moved back. The corners smelled faintly of rosemary and regret. I pulled my quilt from the end of the bed and wrapped it around my knees. It was old now, but I'd sewn it by hand during the spring I turned 27. Each square meant something. The paisley one from Grandma's apron, the green checkered one from an old picnic tablecloth, the navy blue from a blouse I used to love before someone said it made me look broad. I pressed my lips into the fabric and sat there in the dark. They were all quietly voting me out, I thought. One conversation at a time, and soon they'd do it loud enough for the whole town to hear. I'll make them see me, I whispered, my heart steeling for the fight. I kept thinking it couldn't get worse. That somehow if I just stayed out of the way, kept my head down, kept helping where I could, maybe they'd come around. Maybe they'd remember who I used to be to them before the station, before the silence, before the shame became easier to pass off as mine. But no. That afternoon in the kitchen proved just how far gone we were. The sun had barely broken over the trees, casting soft gold light through the blinds. I'd walked in to grab my tea. Ellen and Lila were seated at the island, laptop open, bridal binders spread wide like a holy text. Lila was rattling off numbers, guests, meals, flowers, her voice cool and measured like someone who'd been planning her future her whole life. Ellen looked up and smiled that performative smile she saved for church committees and HOA meetings. "Let's not make this awkward," she said with a butter knife in one hand and her tone dipped in syrup. "It's probably best you don't attend. You'd only ruin it," she added, her voice a venomous whisper. Just like that. Not a suggestion, a sentence, a final decision, delivered like it was in my best interest. Lila didn't even pause, didn't look at me. She clicked her mouse and said, "You understand, right? People talk." "No one wants you there," she said sharply, her eyes cold as ice. I stood there, mug still warm in my palm, fingers curled too tight. "Of course," I heard myself say, but it came out like someone else had borrowed my voice. Later I sat outside on the porch. The air was thick, Colorado spring, still damp from last night's rain. The wood beneath me was splintering in places. The old swing creaked beside me with the weight of what wasn't said. I wasn't even mad, just empty, like a coat left out in the storm. Heavy, soggy, forgotten. I thought about all the birthdays I'd baked for Lila, how I stayed up until midnight in high school sewing sequins onto a second-hand dress she'd wanted to wear to prom, the way she'd twirled in the mirror, gasping, "I actually feel pretty." And I'd smiled. Now those memories tasted like dust, like flour left open too long. A few weeks passed. I went about my routine like I always did. Quiet shifts at the bakery, folding boxes, kneading dough, piping icing while trying not to picture wedding cakes. But the town had its own way of making sure you didn't forget what you'd lost. That Wednesday, just before closing, a woman from church came in. Mrs. Larson, white curls, soft perfume, always had something to say that sounded sweet but sat bitter. She ordered 3 lemon bars, then leaned in as I bagged them. "I heard what happened," she whispered. "Lila said you'd been unwell. That's why you weren't invited. She told the ladies you'd lied about the man who left. Said it was best for everyone's peace of mind. She said you're delusional," Mrs. Larson added, her pity masking cruelty. I didn't reply. She smiled and patted my wrist as if she'd just offered me mercy. Then she left with her lemon bars and her gossip. I stood there, behind the counter, hands gripping the edge like it could keep me upright. "She lied again," I muttered, "didn't she? No one ever corrects a pretty girl in heels." I made it to the back room. Sat down. My apron was dusted with flour and powdered sugar. My hands were trembling. I looked at the microwave door across from me. Its surface was scratched and smudged. My reflection warped like a bad dream. My face stretched, bent, almost unrecognizable. If I disappeared, I whispered, they'd call it a relief before they called it a tragedy. But not everyone looked at me like I was a mistake. 3 days before Lila's wedding, I was in the back of the bakery, arms wrapped around a 30 lb bag of flour, trying not to let it win. The morning was already sticky, the kind of Colorado humidity that made even shade feel like soup. My palms were slick, my patience thinner than parchment. "Need help with that box?" a man's voice asked, steady and low. I looked up, clipboard in hand, sleeves rolled, calm eyes behind square glasses. I'd seen him a few times. Delivery coordinator, I thought. Never said much. "It's heavier than it looks," I said, trying to shift the weight to my hip. He didn't smile like most men do when they're about to make a joke at your expense. Instead, he said, "So are most things worth holding." "You're stronger than they think," he said softly, his words a quiet anchor. That stopped me. Not the words so much as the way he said them, like he actually meant it. Like he might know. He took the flour without ceremony, set it inside near the shelves, and nodded once before walking off. No small talk, no lingering, just help. That was the first time I noticed his name stitched on his shirt. Wyatt Larson. The next time I saw him, it was the morning of Lila's wedding. I'd started baking early. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the mixer and the clink of metal bowls. There were no invites with my name, but the bridal cake still had to be made. I wasn't on the guest list, but I was still part of the labor. By late morning, the bakery smelled of lemon and almonds. I had just pulled the orange tarts from the oven, Lila's favorite, though she'd never said thank you. The back door creaked. "You made that tart again?" Wyatt asked, walking in without disrupting the quiet. I nodded. "One left, then I guess that means it's mine." We didn't say much after that, just sat on the back step, him with the tart, me wiping sugar dust off my pants. Every now and then, he'd glance at the street, and then back down, as if giving me space to speak if I wanted to, but not demanding it. I didn't explain why I wasn't in a dress or at a table with name cards and champagne flutes. He didn't ask, and that made all the difference. "You don't owe them anything," he said suddenly, his voice firm yet kind. Later that afternoon, I was restocking the front when I heard it, low voices, casual like wind through blinds. My manager was at the register talking to a woman in a black catering apron. "Lila's mom called this morning," the caterer said, "requested that Amara not work the counter during the cake delivery, said it might upset the bride." "Oh," my manager said with a shrug. "Guess we'll keep her in the back." I stepped away before they noticed me. In the break room, I untied my apron and folded it over the back of a chair. The space smelled like vanilla and cardboard. I didn't cry. I didn't clench my fist. I didn't even feel sad. I just felt erased, like someone had slowly been trimming my edges for years, and now there was barely anything left to recognize. That evening, I sat at the edge of my bed, journal in my lap. I flipped through the pages, lists, old thoughts, reminders I never read twice. One line stared back at me from a page I'd written weeks ago. "Make peace. Stay small. Be silent." It used to feel like wisdom. Now it read like a prison sentence. I tore the page out and walked to the sink. Watched as the words curled in the flame and turned to ash, smudging the porcelain like they'd never mattered. Because silence hadn't protected me. It had erased me. "I'll make them face me," I declared, my voice trembling with defiance. The next evening, I left the house early. The air was still cool, the sun just beginning to warm the sidewalk outside the old bookshop cafe downtown. Wyatt was already inside when I got there, seated at the back table with 2 mugs of decaf coffee and a paperback half-folded beside him. He slid 1 cup toward me without a word, as if we'd done this a dozen times before. We didn't talk right away. The silence wasn't heavy, it just sat between us like an old friend who didn't need attention. I turned a page in the newspaper, then paused. Wyatt looked over the rim of his cup and asked softly, "Why don't you talk back to them?" I didn't look up. I traced the edge of the page with my fingertip. Because when I did, they laughed louder. His eyes didn't move. He didn't flinch or press. He just nodded like he understood the shape of exhaustion, the kind that sits in your bones, not your voice. "You're enough as you are," he said quietly, his words a balm to my wounds. That sentence stayed with me all day. Later that afternoon, I walked into the hallway outside my bedroom and stared at a photo of me taped crookedly on the wall. I was maybe 15, hair too long, teeth a little crooked, but my smile was wide, full of unknowing hope. Back then, I thought if I just got things right, if I could shrink myself, make fewer ripples, bake the perfect cake, keep quiet, I'd earn a seat at the table. Their table. But all they ever needed was a mirror, and I wasn't willing to reflect their image anymore. By the time dusk set in, the porch light clicked on, flickering from a frayed wire. I stood at the window, staring out past the hedge when the phone rang. I let it ring twice before answering. Ellen's voice was crisp, the same voice she used to speak to bank tellers and choir ladies. "Lila is worried you'll make a scene." I wasn't invited. "That's not the point. It's about dignity, Amara. It's about knowing your place. You'll never fit in," she hissed, her cruelty unmasked. There was a pause. I didn't fill it. She sighed. "You're going to die bitter, Amara. You think being alone is noble. It's just pitiful." I should have said nothing. That had been the rule for years: stay small, stay silent. But something shifted in my chest like a key finally turning. I'm not your shame to manage anymore. I'm done with your lies, I said firmly, my voice unshakable. I didn't yell. I didn't wait for a reply. I just hung up, and it felt clean. That night, I pulled a canvas bag from under my bed. Inside was the quilt I'd been working on in pieces, fabric scraps from bakery aprons, thread I'd saved from old spools, a corner of blue silk I'd kept since the day my mother handed the heirloom necklace to Lila like I never existed. I smoothed the quilt over my lap, letting my fingers trace each seam, each story stitched inside. This, I whispered to the dark, is mine, not inherited, not handed down, not given out of guilt. Mine. The next afternoon, I folded the quilt carefully into a canvas tote and walked down to the general store before my shift. The streets were still wet from a light rain, giving the sidewalks that dusty shimmer Fort Collins always had after a storm. Wyatt was restocking a display of jams when I stepped in. The doorbell jingled lightly behind me. He looked up, wiped his hands on his apron, and met me at the counter without saying a word. I have something for you, I said, placing the quilt on the wooden surface between us. It's stitched with the life I've been trying to keep quiet. He didn't unwrap it right away. He just looked at me, really looked, then placed his hand gently over the folded cloth. You sure? He asked. I nodded. It needs to be seen by someone who doesn't expect it to apologize first. This is who you are, he said, his voice warm with belief. We didn't hug. We didn't smile. But something softened in the room. That evening, Lila posted a new engagement photo. She was in a fitted cream dress that looked like it hadn't been sat down in. Nathan stood next to her, beaming, both of them framed by the stone archway of the same train station where I'd once waited alone in the snow. Her caption read, "Some girls get to watch, others get chosen." The photo went viral in our small circle. Friends from church commented hearts and clapping emojis. Others chimed in with snide remarks. Isn't that her sister in the background? Oof. Cold, but true. Well, at least she knows her lane. I didn't comment. I didn't reply. I just posted one photo of the quilt spread across the kitchen table, sunlight catching on the blue silk corner, the stitches like veins of memory. No caption, no tags, just the image. By the end of the night, it had over 150 shares. One comment stood out. This says more than any ring ever could. Later that week, while closing the bakery, I found a folded note taped to the fridge in the staff room. It was written in blue ink on bakery receipt paper. No name. They told me to smile more, too. But you didn't, and it gave me permission not to. I read it 3 times, then folded it into my coat pocket. When I got home that night, I pulled down a shoebox from the top of the closet. It was old, stained at the corners with tape holding one side shut. Inside were all the letters Nathan had sent after he left me at the station. Unopened, stamped, returned to sender, but sent anyway. I took the box outside to the fire pit behind the house. The moon was high and sharp. One by one, I fed the letters into the flame. They curled, hissed, vanished. No more letters, no more silence. I'm free of their chains, I said to the flames, my heart unburdened. The next evening, I got a message. Not an invitation, just a polite request from Ellen. She asked if I'd mind dropping off one of my tarts for the wedding dessert table as a courtesy. Said Lila still liked my baking, even if we weren't on speaking terms. I didn't answer. I baked the tart anyway. My orange and ginger recipe, with a butter crust and pecan finish. I tied it with a navy ribbon, the color of all those half-swallowed emotions. They never let me speak. Inside the box, I placed one thing, just one. A single linen napkin. The one with the daisy I stitched by hand when I was 8 years old. The one I pressed into my palm the day they humiliated me at brunch. The one that had soaked tears more times than any face cloth ever had. No note, no warning, just history folded with care. I walked it down to the community center basement where the caterers were unloading trays and tulle. I handed it off, smiled once, and turned back before anyone could ask who I was. They didn't know what was in the box, but when they opened it, none of them said a word. The box had been delivered the previous afternoon, tucked neatly between trays of macarons and chocolate ganache. I hadn't stayed to watch them open it. I didn't need to, because the next morning, without invitation or announcement, I arrived someplace else entirely, on my own terms. The sky that morning was soft with early spring haze, the kind that made the town feel suspended in gentle quiet. Wyatt and I had chosen a modest riverside venue just outside Fort Collins, nothing grand, just honest. As guests gathered, there was a hush, more murmuring than conversation. Whispers passed like wind through wheat. Some were curious, some confused, some regretful, and then they came. Ellen, Glenn, and Leela stepped out of a rented SUV and onto the gravel lot, with the exact timing of people used to being watched. They weren't invited, but they came anyway, dressed to the teeth, carrying nothing but presents, and the assumption they still held weight in my story. They smiled at guests who didn't smile back. They nodded to ushers who didn't move. They sat on the far end of the aisle, not touching, not speaking, each one holding their silence like a script they were too proud to rewrite. Inside the venue, light filtered through sheer curtains. Wyatt stood beneath a metal arch, quiet and steady, no nerves, no speech rehearsed, just his eyes searching the room and then landing on me. The music didn't swell, there were no orchids. I opened the door myself. I stepped into the room in a dress I had sewn from ivory lace, not white. The lining was stitched with threads from bakery aprons, remnants of scraps I'd once been told weren't elegant enough. It didn't shimmer, it didn't hug every curve, but it fit in my hand. A bouquet wrapped in the napkin from all those years ago, daisy embroidered, soft from age, and stronger for it. Gasps, then silence. Every eye followed me down the aisle and then turned toward my family, but none of them could lift their heads. Not Ellen, with her coral lipstick slightly smudged. Not Glenn, whose hands were clenched into fists on his lap. Not Lila, who kept blinking like she didn't know where to look. I didn't smirk. I didn't even glance their way because the moment I stepped forward wasn't about them anymore. It was about that girl in the snow, the one who'd stood waiting without answers, without dignity, without rescue. She had walked through shame and silence to make it here, and today she arrived. Later at the reception, a simple spread of chocolate bars, lemonade, and orange tart, guests came up to me one by one, not to apologize, not to explain, but their voices were different. "You look beautiful," said a woman from church who'd once whispered behind my back. Her tone now was softer, her eyes uncertain. I just nodded. Wyatt leaned toward me as I passed him a slice of cake. "They look like they've seen a ghost," he said quietly. "No," I replied, brushing my fingers against his. "They're just realizing I never left." "You showed them who you are," he said, his pride in me a quiet strength. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the guests began to leave. Chairs were folded, dishes stacked. Wyatt walked the last tray to the kitchen while I stood on the porch, still in my dress, still barefoot. Beside the cake knife lay the stitched napkin. I picked it up, pressed it to my palm once again. It didn't sting this time. It felt whole. "They never said sorry," I whispered to the wind, "and maybe they never will." But I didn't need it, because the most sacred vow I made that day wasn't to Wyatt. It was to myself. To never again be quiet for the comfort of those who only see you when you shrink. To never again measure my worth by their absence of kindness. And above all, to remember I was never the weight they feared. I was the mirror they refused to. I reclaimed my truth, but their silence lingers, a scar I carry as I forge a new path, unbroken, yet forever changed.